He's accusing these different people of being communists. And basically, the Alger Hiss case, he was credited with sending his Soviet handler specific government documents on film that he would place in a pumpkin patch inside of pumpkins, and then the Soviet handler would go pick it up. And there was some loose evidence of this, and so that's going to lead to him being convicted of perjury for saying he didn't do that or didn't have any kind of part in this operation. And then Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, probably the biggest show trial and kind of legitimacy behind communists being a part of our society in the United States. They were accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, partly based on testimony from Ethel's brother. They were tried and both executed in 1953, and they're the only Americans executed for espionage during the Cold War. And so the trial remains controversial to this day, obviously, especially regarding Ethel's level of involvement. A lot of people said Ethel Rosenberg didn't really know exactly what was going on, that she was just kind of lumped in with her husband. Regardless, they were both executed, and there was no undoing that, right? And so there's going to be a public outcry of extremism and the responses to the Second Red Scare. What else? This Second Red Scare is going to reflect how Cold War fears are going to affect American society, undermining civil liberties, just like we talked about in World War I, where kind of there's a crackdown on civil liberties and speaking out against the government and things like that with the Sedition Acts. And so it also showed, this promotion of conformity and suspicion, and it paved the way for Joseph McCarthy from 1950 to 1954 to make sweeping and false accusations of communists within the government, usually his political opponents. And that's going to be known as the kind of McCarthy era or McCarthyism. So this period blurred the line between national security and political repression, and its legacy is still debated in American civil rights history. All right? So the rise and fall of McCarthyism, basically Senator Joseph McCarthy, the Republican from Wisconsin, became the face of the Red Scare. In the early 1950s, he claimed to possess a list of all the communists working within the U.S. State Department, though he never produced this list or any solid evidence of their ties to the communist regime. They held televised hearings where he gained popularity alongside of Richard Nixon, and essentially a bunch of show trials. He capitalized on the public anxiety during the Cold War to boost his political influence. He wanted to run for president. Some of the tactics: McCarthy chaired the Senate Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations, where he held televised hearings, interrogated federal employees, army officials, and private citizens, and rarely had any kind of concrete proof. Many accusations were based on innuendos and guilt by association of people that they were kind of, acquainted with. So it ruined reputations through vague, though the vague claims were obviously not backed up by fact, and some leading questions. He created a culture of fear within the government where people were afraid to speak out or associate with leftist ideas, even in academia, arts, and civil society. And then his eventual downfall comes in 1954 with the Army McCarthy hearings. So McCarthy overreached by accusing the U.S. Army of harboring communists, and the televised hearings exposed his bullying tone, his evasive answers, and lack of evidence that he actually brought to the public, and public opinion would turn against him. And later that year, the Senate voted to censure Joseph McCarthy, and his power collapsed. He faded from political relevance before his death in 1957, 3 short years later. So a lot of people said the tarnishing of his record is what ultimately killed him. Obviously, that's not the truth. But, it's going to kill his political career, and then eventually he died 3 years later. So some of the effects are on American society and politics. Obviously, this is an example of suppression of dissent. McCarthy made it dangerous to express any kind of left-leaning ideology or even mildly liberal political views. And many people self-censored or distanced themselves from causes like civil rights. So it's going to set civil rights back a couple decades, fearing that they'd be labeled as subversive and be part of this blacklist in the United States. And of course, blacklisting and career destruction. Thousands of people in the entertainment, education, and government industries lost jobs or were denied work due to unproven accusations. Hollywood's blacklist, like I said, included actors, writers, directors that were banned for working and refusing to cooperate with the HUAC's suspected leftist symptoms. So some public anxiety is going to result in this. Obviously, the Second Red Scare encouraged cultural conformity and a distrust of non-traditional ideas. Families and workers were encouraged to conform to American values and prove their loyalty. And then there's going to be bipartisan support for anti-communism as well. Despite McCarthy's fall, both Democrats and Republicans continued to back Cold War policies that fought communism abroad and suppressed it at home. This led to loyalty programs, surveillance by the FBI, and foreign interventions under the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, and of course CIA coups all over Latin America and Asia, and even in Africa. Some historical legacies here. McCarthyism is still kind of a cautionary tale today of political extremism and the erosion of civil liberties and the kind of power of fear in shaping politics. And it had a chilling effect on American society and prompted later reflection on the balance of national security and individual rights. We would see this happen again after 9/11 and kind of the overreaching power of the Department of Homeland Security and monitoring of emails and text communications and phone calls through the Patriot Act that is still criticized to this day. All right, and this is some of the show trial here depicted. All right, the economy after the war. How do we think the economy grows after the war? It's going to be positive. It's going to be positive growth and sustainable growth because we become this consumer-based economy after World War II. We're entered into this golden age of economic prosperity, fueled by both consumer demand and government investment. So there's boom in the private sectors where wartime savings, rising wages, and confidence in the economy led to Americans to spend more on homes, cars, and consumer goods. And American businesses expanded rapidly to meet this demand, creating jobs and boosting production. And because of all of these people buying cars and this new culture of buying cars, you have the process of suburbanization, where now you have the ability to commute to work inside these cities, and so the suburbs grow kind of exponentially. Federal spending is going to drive this growth. The government invested heavily in infrastructure and national defense. In 1956, this is where we get 40,000 miles of highways and interstate. So this is the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 under the Eisenhower administration. The GI Bill is also going to be passed to help veterans attend college and buy homes and fuel upward mobility. You have investment in defense industries like aerospace and electronics that help maintain a strong economy during the Cold War, because there's this still kind of competition and proxy war going on. Just like we were able to thrive during World War II by converting into wartime industries, now we're expanding that during the Cold War. Technological innovation would surge as well. Wartime research led to post-war advances in medicine, electronics, and computing. And these innovations led to new industries and new jobs. And then coupled with that, you have from 1946 to 64, the baby boom. So this surge in births created demand for homes, schools, baby products, and household goods. And this cycle of demand is going to further stimulate economic growth and fuel the rise of the consumer economy in the United States. So you have the rise of the new American middle class, and of course mass consumerism that is going to pave the way for suburbanization. So the GI Bill and economic prosperity made home ownership and upward mobility accessible to now the middle class and millions of new members of the middle class. Communities like Levittown, New York are going to pop up all over the United States, which represented the new suburban ideal, affordable mass-produced homes for middle-class families, which is pretty much the norm today. And it promoted a car culture where shopping, entertainment, and commuting required automobiles. So this has positive effects and negative effects. Now you could live inside the suburbs and have your own plot of land, right, and not be jammed up next to somebody. Yeah. But then it's going to be unbridled growth to where the suburbs take over agricultural land, and now everybody has to drive cars into cities. But the roads into those cities weren't built for this mass kind of transportation effort, and so now you're going to have, obviously traffic jams and just kind of like chokeholds on that infrastructure that needs to be updated. You also have movement patterns to the south and the west during this time period, to the Sun Belt. That was driven by lower taxes, job opportunities, especially defense and aerospace, and warmer climates. Cities like Houston, Phoenix, and Los Angeles are going to grow rapidly during this period, and the Sun Belt would emerge as a political force that shifts congressional power and electoral influence away from the Northeast and Midwest, because as more people move there, what happens? More voters, which means a higher number of electoral votes assigned to those states, right? As a response, because the electoral number of the votes that they get as a result of the election is based on your population, it's per capita. And so states like Florida and Texas and California are going to gain more electoral power. And it's going to lead to more representation for the South and the West in congressional elections and presidential elections. All right, some demographic shifts. Obviously, you're going to have some political consequences. Migration to the Sun Belt led to redistribution of political power, more seats in Congress, more electoral college votes, and this shift influenced national policy debates, especially around taxes and defense. The cultural impact, it led to the rise of fast food, drive-ins, and shopping malls when we see suburbanization of the car culture. And American life became increasingly centered on comfort, convenience, and consumption. Diversity and inclusion also becomes part of this as well. Racial and ethnic diversity increased in cities and suburbs, especially as labor needs grew. And over time, racial tensions and civil rights activism evolved views on American identity. So that's the next topic we will look at, kind of the culture after 1945. I know I'm going through this fast, but remember this is all posted on Teams. You basically need to know suburbanization. That's the big key to the effect of this time period for the economy. Baby boom, suburbanization. Those are the two things. Okay. And then the culture, you have the rise of mass culture because television, right? So now most American homes have a TV in it, and you can kind of have a national audience. So television became a central medium. Popular shows like Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy promote traditional family values, gender roles, and suburban ideals. And TV unified the country with sharing programming, and advertising contributed to a nationwide American dream image, right? So they can promote this idea of a white picket fence in the suburbs. Consumer culture and suburban life, new products, fast food like McDonald's and shopping malls became a part of the suburban lifestyle. And the growth of the middle class supported standardized lifestyles centered on material comfort and routine. Youth culture emerged as well. You have teens that had disposable income now and became a target market for fashion, music, and entertainment. Rock and roll music, drive-in theaters are going to shape the teenage identity. Mass media's role in magazines, TV, and radio, they're going to promote patriotism, conformity, and consumerism, and reinforce gender expectation as women as housemakers. If you've ever watched I Love Lucy, she doesn't have a job, she's working in the home. The way that Ricky Ricardo talks to her in the series is very traditional, let's say, in his expectations. One of the days they're fighting, and he comes into the room, and he's like, "You're not going to make me breakfast? What am I going to do? I'm going to starve to death." And it's like, okay, well, you can see the traditional gender roles carry over even to these TV shows in the 1950s and 60s, right? That's going to change, though, as the baby boomers get a little bit older, which is hard to kind of wrap our minds around, maybe, that they're going to be part of this counterculture movement, but they would. And they would fight for things like civil rights. So some of the challenges to cultural homogeneity, or just basically homogenous culture, is that, or a singular culture, is that not everyone's going to embrace these new cultural norms, especially the older generation from ex-World War II vets and things like that. Artists, intellectuals, and youth are going to push back against this kind of conformity that they are trying to promote, and you get the beatnik generation, or the beat generation, where writers like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac rejected materialism, sexual repression, and conformity, and embraced spirituality, spontaneity, and non-traditional lifestyles, including drug usage, okay, which becomes extremely popular, specifically with LSD. And so modern art movements, you have abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock that challenged realist conventions and emphasized personal expression. And then the youth rebellion of the 50s and 60s, where rock music like Elvis Presley and the Beatles broke away from traditional music forms and had anti-war sentiment and all that kind of wrapped up into their music, and that stirred some generational divides. You also have the civil rights movement that mobilized youth to confront racism, inequality, and injustice, and these were early indicators of the broader counterculture movement that would emerge in the 60s and continue into the 70s as we get engaged in Vietnam. Some of the different shifts: traditionalism versus liberalism, that has kind of been evident throughout all of American history, where you have the liberal-conservative divide. Conflicts emerged between conservative values and reform movements. So conservative upheld religious values, gender norms, and Cold War patriotism. Reformers pushed for free expression, civil rights, and sexual freedom. And some of the religious and social realignments, some of the regions in the United States saw revivals of Christian evangelicalism, like in the South, the Sun Belt is going to see this religious influence on politics, where instead of a separation between church and state, they advocate for an integrated system. Other areas trended towards secularism and questioning of authority, especially among the youth and the beatnik generation. Immigration and demographic change would occur as well as immigration increased in the post-war period. Racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity of the U.S. grows, particularly in border states, right, between places like Mexico and the United States, and of course on the West Coast with Asian immigration as well. And this contributed to debates about national identity and cultural expression and all those things that we know from this era. Some of the legacies of this time period: the cultural shifts of the post-war world laid the foundation for later social revolutions, so women's rights, LGBTQ activism, environmentalism, anti-war protests during Vietnam. These challenges to conformity helped broaden the definition of what it meant to be an American, and it became more inclusive, beyond just the Cold War patriotism and nuclear family life, so you're going to see this shift. Overall, the post-war landscape is going to become increasingly pluralistic, meaning that there's going to be multiple views that are going to shape American identity, setting the stage for the second half of the 20th century and the civil rights movement. All right, so a lot of things. You have to know the Beatnik generation, though. The counterculture movement, the hippies, you have to know that. And I feel like that's pretty easy to remember. All right. Okay, the first movement in the civil rights era in the 40s and 50s is going to start really in World War II with the Double V campaign. So if you remember the context of that, the African-American newspapers, especially Pittsburgh Courier, are going to launch this campaign called Double V, Victory Against Fascism and Victory Against Racism at Home. And it highlighted the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom overseas while Black Americans were denied civil rights at home. And so there was first the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948 by President Truman. He issued Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the U.S. military, but that didn't end segregation, right? It marked the first major federal action towards civil rights in the 20th century and set the precedent for future presidents and courts that they would build on to integrate society. The biggest landmark case you have to know from this time period is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. I'm sure you've heard of this before, but it's a landmark case in which the Supreme Court unanimously overturned Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. And if you remember, that allowed for separate but equal, basically, segregation to continue. So they overturned that case and declared racial segregation in public education inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund argued the case using psychological and legal evidence. While it was a victory, the decision faced massive resistance in the South. Surprise, surprise. And white citizens' councils and some Southern governors called for massive resistance. Federal courts are going to require gradual desegregation, which was slow and uneven in the South and often required federal directives to actually be carried out. Other legal strategies: the NAACP works systematically through the courts to dismantle Jim Crow laws. They're going to take executive actions like Truman's desegregation order to show federal interest. Consistent enforcement, though, was kind of lacking. And you're going to have some civil rights gains in the 1950s. They were often symbolic or limited in scope, but they built kind of critical momentum that they needed for the future. Examples of the grassroots activism that would take place: the Montgomery bus boycotts in 1955 to 1956, which was sparked by, obviously, Rosa Parks' arrest for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on the Montgomery bus in Alabama. And, of course, this directive led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Black community organized a year-long boycott of the city bus system. And so that's going to kind of force the hand of these private businesses and city organizations that are going to have to incorporate desegregation policies. It resulted in a Supreme Court ruling that bus segregation was unconstitutional. So again, you see the floodgates start to open for desegregation. King rose to national prominence as a result of this as well. And the role of media is going to have an ever-increasing role in civil rights activism. Photographs, newsreels, TV coverage began to expose how racist the South was and how that institution of racism is now being displayed for a national audience leads to these reforms. So media attention created sympathy for the movement and made it more difficult for federal officials to ignore the call for justice, as you're going to see this resistance in the South. Right, so you definitely need to know MLK Jr., right? I'm pretty sure you're familiar with him. And you definitely need to know Rosa Parks, which hopefully you are familiar with as well. Right, so not too much new stuff here, hopefully. right? And then, of course, we start to become this world power in the Cold War era. So some of the, I meant to mention this with the civil rights movement, but again, this is going to lay the groundwork for the next movement in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, Dr. King is going to become a national figure. He would be assassinated in the 60s. So anyways, moving on to the expansion of us as a world power. As a part of Cold War containment, the U.S. intervened politically and militarily to limit Soviet influence during this era. CIA-backed coups in Guatemala and in Cuba are going to lead to the establishment of communist states under Fidel Castro, and communist regimes coming to power, or at least trying to come to power in Latin America that lead to a lot of other CIA interventions. The U.S. is going to respond to this Cuban crisis with, of course, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and you can see they took a spy plane image of the location in Cuba where they saw the nuclear silos were being positioned towards the United States, leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, there's this debate over nuclear policy in the military-industrial complex. So you have the rise of nuclear arsenals that raise public concern. Why? Because nuclear weapons are dangerous to society. And the U.S. develops a hydrogen bomb and expands our nuclear triad, land, sea, and air-based systems, to even kind of worsen the threat of a nuclear fallout. Critics would warn of unchecked military-industrial complex. This is a term popularized by Eisenhower in his 1961 farewell address, and what it refers to is the relationship with private organizations that get military contracts to build weapons, and the structure of the military with the Secretary of Defense kind of leading those contracts and giving it to political allies, and how that's going to lead to massive production of weapons and ultimately be good for the economy and creating jobs, but be bad for like national security because of the fallout that could come from it. So some Americans supported nuclear deterrence and defense spending, while others are going to fear permanent war economies and a loss of democratic accountability. And of course, if you're trying to show that we're easing tensions, the worst thing you can do is build up a nuclear arsenal. So the Cold War in Africa and the Middle East is going to emerge as well in the 60s. You have this U.S.-USSR competition for influence in newly decolonized nations. So the wave of decolonization is going to sweep over Africa and Asia in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that's where they drive for independence, basically, as their colonizers pull out control in these regions, like in Sudan and in Egypt and in Angola and Algeria. You have the British and the French basically pulling out forces and leaving the power vacuum to whoever's left. And if you remember, in the age of imperialism, how did they decide where to draw the lines on the borders for countries in Africa or the colonies in Africa? What did they use to determine that? When you have this wave of European imperialism and American imperialism in the region. What did they base it off of? Huh? Resources, right? Instead of who lived there. And so ethnic groups that disagreed with each other and could not peacefully coexist got lumped into these colonies that now when they become independent, it's going to lead to a power struggle and eventually, in a lot of cases, genocide. So it's going to be a very violent upheaval, and it's going to be supported by both the U.S. and USSR, respectively, for these decolonized nations to gain some support and alignment. Some would not align with either the United States and USSR, and that's called the non-aligned movement. So you have people like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Gandhi in India who would lead this non-aligned movement and not want to accept any kind of aid from either country. And that's going to lead to the third world countries emerging, or the non-aligned countries. In Africa, backed by pro-Western leaders in Congo, Angola, and other post-colonial states, they're going to resist Soviet expansion. And in the Middle East, the support of Israel and conservative monarchies in Saudi Arabia are going to lead to a series of wars. The British and the United States and the French are going to back the Israeli invasion of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula in the Six-Day War, right after Israel was basically founded. And essentially that's going to lead to an attempt to seize the Suez Canal and just a lot of political turmoil in the region, where all the Arab nations kind of rise up against Israel in 1956. And it's going to just become a series of wars that obviously have lasting effects to this day and shape the alliances that were built in the Middle East to this day as well. So the proxy wars don't always work out, right? In a lot of cases, it leads to more instability. We were engaged in covert operations as well in Iran. They had a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, that we engaged in CIA operations in Iran to overthrow his power. And the region remained politically unstable and led to kind of a theocracy being formed in the post-CIA operation Iran. So they're going to move more towards like a religious theocracy controlled by extremism. So that one didn't work out either. Some other things you need to be familiar with. What else? Oh, the war in Vietnam. All right, specifically with the war in Vietnam, we get involved, like I said, in the early phase to support French recontrol over the region, and specifically Indochina was their previous colony. From 1947 to 1955, we would support the French militarily, and we would support them economically to fight this war to regain Indochina. In response, the French are going to be bled dry, basically, and they are forced to retreat out of Vietnam specifically. Ho Chi Minh is going to be leading the communist effort in the north to reunify all of Vietnam under communism, but communism wasn't really the goal. The goal was autonomy and separation from the West. We misunderstood kind of the assignment here, and we backed a dictator in the South. He was a democratically elected dictator, allegedly, but he was a Catholic, and he persecuted Buddhists. His name was Ngo Dinh Diem. And essentially the Buddhists hated him so much that they would burn themselves alive in town squares to protest his rule. And so obviously when we start backing this guy, they're going to turn against us as well in South Vietnam, certain civilian populations that would create the resistance in the South known as the Viet Cong, who are working for the North Vietnamese. And then of course you also have to face the North Vietnamese troops that are fighting through Cambodia and through North Vietnam to unify the whole region. So a lot of missteps early on are going to lead to a struggling campaign for us as we move on into the 60s and 70s, and we start to get directly involved in the early 1960s under LBJ's administration in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where we allegedly had been fired upon by North Vietnamese boats, and essentially it came out later that this was not actually the case. It was a false flag incident just so that we could go to war and get congressional approval, which we did. Under LBJ, and we led American forces into South Vietnam to support Ngo Dinh Diem's government. Some major turning points for the war and the U.S. involvement. Obviously, the introduction of U.S. combat troops is going to change the shape of the war and mark the start of a full-scale military engagement in Vietnam. And we're going to use anti-tank and ballistic missiles in the Vietnam campaign. We would drop more bombs on Vietnam and Korea than we dropped in the entirety of World War II. And so obviously it's going to be a lot of death and destruction associated with both Korea and Vietnam. But specifically, we're going to use some defoliage chemical agents known as Agent Orange, and that's going to lead to cancers and all kinds of things later on after the war is over, and also lead to a high civilian death in this campaign to take control of North Vietnam. So North Vietnam framed the war as a continuation of anti-imperialist struggle against French and American intervention, and many nations with the non-aligned movements refused to pick sides in this conflict. So the U.S. struggled to gain international legitimacy for its intervention, and there's going to be a lot of criticism also at home, right? So there's going to be anti-war protest at home, which helps get Nixon elected. He runs on this campaign of Vietnamization. And basically his plan was like, the war is not going well, we're going to work to reduce the number of troops in the South and essentially pull back our intervention of Vietnam and essentially call it an L and move on, right? The problem was with the Vietnamization plan, he did train the troops in the South and start removing U.S. forces in 1972 and 73, but they're also going to bomb Cambodia and the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. That leads to some instability in the region and, of course, civilian populations rising up against the U.S. forces that were left. And it's going to lead to some death and destruction in the region, especially as Pol Pot rises to power in Cambodia and kills about a third of his population in the Cambodian genocide. So instability, breeds more instability, basically, in the Vietnam War. And then as the war dragged on, obviously U.S. casualties and media coverage turned public opinion. This is the first televised war in the United States where really we have like day-by-day coverage by news organizations where the Tet Offensive is going to reveal that the U.S. government claims of success were exaggerated. This was a massive counter-campaign by the North Vietnamese where they were extremely successful and killed a lot of U.S. forces and South Vietnamese forces in the process. We're going to lose over 56,000 troops in the Vietnam campaign altogether, which doesn't sound like a high number, but it's a pretty high number when we were just supposed to be, it was supposed to be a special military operation that turned into a full-scale war. And then, of course, the massive protests that would erupt across college campuses and cities like Kent State would lead to even more instability as the National Guard would be sent in 1970. And that symbolized the tension between government and anti-war protests, and 4 students would be shot in the process. Americans increasingly started to question presidential war powers, which led to the War Powers Act of 1973, that you had to get congressional approval. You couldn't just go through the UN and all these different things. The role of the military and the military-industrial complex, trying to limit the military contracts and nuclear proliferation, and the morality and effectiveness of U.S. foreign policy of containment. So we're going to move away from containment a second time, where we're like, okay, for real this time, let's not get involved in these proxy wars. And then we would get involved in another proxy war in 1979. So we didn't learn our lessons. The end of the war is going to lead to, like I said, Vietnamization. South Vietnamese forces would take over and would be unsuccessful in the next 2 years, losing control to North Vietnamese communism, and of course falling in 1975. And the reunification happens. So basically, the goal of the war was to not have them unify under communism, and the end result was they unified under communism. So call it what you want. I call that a loss. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 ended direct U.S. involvement, and the fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam. Long-term consequences: 58,000 U.S. deaths and deep national trauma, growing public distrust in the government linked to events like the Pentagon Papers that exposed the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the false flag incident, and the war's legacy influenced U.S. foreign policy for caution in later decades with the idea of Vietnam syndrome. Let's not get involved in these prolonged proxy wars that just bleed our troops dry and we have no end result that is favorable, right? And you can see Agent Orange being dropped there by U.S. soldiers, and a lot of those U.S. soldiers would be exposed to this chemical agent, and it wouldn't kill them, but 20 years later they would contract cancers from it, and so eventually the VA would have to pay out benefits to their families as a result of using and handling Agent Orange. And of course, napalm was also used. Anybody know what napalm is?
Yeah.
Liquid explosives, basically, that cause massive fires. Why did they need napalm and Agent Orange? The jungle, right? To get rid of all of the foliage, to be able to see the enemy, because that was the thing. The Vietnamese were really good at home field advantage and using guerrilla tactics to surprise U.S. forces. And, that's going to lead to the need to get rid of all these hiding spots, basically. It wouldn't be successful, but we dropped it on civilian populations, too. And so that's going to lead to, obviously, some long-term, prolonged consequences for Vietnam. All right. Whew, that was a lot of stuff today, I know. But we are going to stop there for today. And let's see how much time we have left. We have 9 minutes, so never mind. I'm not going to do it.
33 minutes.
We will just stop here.
But I want to watch it back. You can watch it back just like later.
Christian, should I make a dictionary on what each thing means?
No.
Respect.
You're gonna get a dictionary?
Yeah. How is it the only thing you think about? He said like
My pencil.
breakfast. Breakfast is crazy. I already put that up. You should try
Yeah, I'm not pencil. Give me back over there.
You are.
There's also the American Dad series they have where I ran Roger Scandal, where he goes through like the stories of Congress and how they supported the but it uses the term rape throughout, and I'm like, it's good, it's really good, and it covers the scandal really well, but it talks about freaking rape. If I could edit that clip, maybe.
Why is Buddy obese?
CIA
Why is Buddy pregnant?
That's when the CIA started to get some.
Remember their faces lost.
Oh, wait. You know who he looks like? You know who he looks like?
Yeah. Well, that's like the YouTube spy plane incident.
But he's got,
Beavis and Butthead's great.
but he's got the artistic style of Beavis and Butthead.
You gotta put that in. Emo.
Fell down
Side by side.
Emo era.
You got captured. You killed and he did. Because he did. And you were here nationally on television. And he said, "You didn't send a spy plane to the Soviet Union." You're like, "Really? You forgot."
I don't see a difference.
Here we go.
Yeah, I mean,
Are you signing these?
it is. And we haven't never really
Worth millions.
Yeah, I don't want that.
You got you with your hands on your face.
Wilson got both his targets.
I was sleeping.
One fell
Recreate them. I was
Where
sleeping.
are targets?
Recreate them.
36.
Ali and Beyonce.
Like Tanner's out. That function might be screwed.
Getting recorded.
True.
37 minutes. They're
I've
signed.
never seen such more fan activity.
We are selling you.
Why are you going places together?
I'm putting this on Pornhub. Huh?
Any ideas?
We're just selling Jackson movies.
You're playing
I'm putting this on Pornhub. Wait. I actually have an account. I could probably actually.
That's crazy.
Hey, we should show them the time. Oh, no, we already told him. You're at 37 minutes.
I know.
Brazil, Iran,
Who wants the Jackson collection?
South Africa.
The Jackson collection?
India is starting to come forward too. I think it's Iran, but they're also because they want to get off of the job. They don't want to like use it because we'll see what happens.
God is lacking.
China and South Africa.
Put it on there. Put it on there.
It's hard to tell. Really.
Do you hold this, please?
Brayden. Andrew Garfield is not the best friend. No, he's not.
What is this?
Tell me
My
what.
father.
What?
I didn't get anybody sick.
First you got me sick.
Oh, that's what Mary is.
If it hasn't already started,
Devin, the camera's blocked. Hey, ready? Today's story is about Jackson. Let's see what he's doing now. What is this, Peppa Pig?
Why, yeah, why are we filming a Peppa Pig episode?
Jackson is on his phone. He's scrolling through Joel's Discord server. Let's see what happens in 5 seconds. Oh, he has something to share with us. Jackson has something to share with us. Let's see what it is. Joel is trying to show a Discord server which is not advised for children of your age. Let's go back to the shed.
Sometimes when I stretch, I let out a pimp my nose.
Still not.
You had 40 minutes.
Divided into areas, like one side.
This is Unemployment 101. Yeah, why are we filming a Peppa Pig episode? This is
Because you just hit 40 minutes.
This is Mommy Pigs.
Joel,
Attention
James
is shit.
Frost.
Attention is shit. Mega. James.
You're not making a
Bro. Joel, what did I just see?
doing.
Joel,
Well, that's the thing.
Joel,
It's a tax on
what did I just
we
see?
don't import a lot of Chinese.
Put it on the camera. Put it on the camera.
Joel, bro, why is it every single picture you touch has some type of dumb term?
That was Joel.
My fault, OG.
No, Joel, the clock is ticking with Discord. I didn't do anything.
I just video.